Welcome back everyone, I'm Nick. This channel is Swiftful Thinking, where we cover everything Swift and SwiftUI related. And before we begin, I first want to thank all of you who are leaving amazing comments on my videos. I am super appreciative. You guys make it so much more enjoyable for me to actually bring out and make this content. So thank you all of you who are watching and following along. And with that said, in this video, we're going to tackle the Codable protocol. So although Codable is extremely easy to implement, there's actually a lot going on under the hood that you probably didn't know about. So in this video, we're going to use the Codable protocol, but before we do, we're actually going to look at everything that's happening behind the scenes, because that's really what is more important and what you should know as the developer. Now, the reason we even need this Codable protocol is so that we can decode and encode our data. Basically what that means is when we download data from the internet, it doesn't come in a data form that we can actually use. We need to decode that data into the data structure that we have in our app. So first we're going to learn how to decode data from JSON data on the internet to data that we can use in our app. And then we're going to learn how we can do the reverse, and we can take the data in our app and we can encode it to send it back out to the internet as JSON data. We're going to then wrap up by actually using the Codable protocol, which includes decoding and encoding, all done for us behind the scenes. And the reason we're doing this is because in the next video, we are finally ready to start downloading data from the internet. So hope you guys are excited. I hope this video helps you, and let's jump into Xcode and take a look. Alright, welcome back everyone. I'm back in our Xcode project as always. Let's right click on the navigator, create a new file. This will be a SwiftUI view, and we're going to call this one Codable Bootcamp. Go ahead and click create. Let's click resume on the canvas, and let's get started. And in the last video, we learned how to use escape enclosures. And the point of that was so that we can get returned data when we go out and download data from a database or from the internet. So we're building up to actually being able to download data and then use it in our app. But when we download data from the internet, it's not in a form that we can actually put directly into our app. We first need to decode that data from whatever data type it is in, which is usually JSON data, and then convert it into something that we can actually use locally. So before we actually download data from the internet, I want to introduce you guys and explain what the Codable protocol is, because that's what we use to convert that data into something that we can actually use. So let's start out this view by creating a view model as we often do. So let's create a class. Let's call this Codable View Model. Let's make it conform to observable object and open the brackets. Let's initialize this in our view with an @state object var VM for view model, and we'll set it equal to the Codable View Model. All right, we're going to create a model as well. So this is our view model, this is our view, and then we're going to create a model to complete the MVVM setup. And again, if you don't know what MVVM architecture is, I've covered it in the last playlist where we did a to-do app. I've also covered it in a bunch of videos in this playlist. So you guys should be getting a little familiar with this now. And for our struct, let's maybe pretend like we have an app where we have customers. So we'll create a model for the customer. So we'll create a struct. We'll call it customer model. We'll open the brackets. And every customer is going to have a name. So we'll say let name of type string. We'll pretend like every customer has maybe a certain number of points in our system. So we'll say let points of type int. And maybe our customers have the option of being premium customers. So we'll say let is premium of type bool. This will just be true or false whether or not they are premium. And I want to use this in a for each in our view, so let's make this conform to identifiable. And I've covered identifiable previously, so you should be aware of it. If not, go check out the earlier videos in this playlist. As I always do in my playlists, the videos are building on top of each other, so they're meant to be watched in order, because I don't want to be throwing in protocols like this identifiable before you actually know what it is. All right, so to conform to identifiable, we just do let ID, And normally I set this equal to a random ID, and we use UUID, open close parentheses, dot string. But when we are downloading stuff from the internet, chances are we're going to get that ID from the internet. We're not going to actually create a random ID locally. So because of that, we're going to create an ID, and it will just be of type string. So when we create customer models, we will actually add our ID in manually. All right, now that we have the model, let's first set one up in the view and get it all connected. So in our view model, we'll create an @published var. We'll call this customer, of type customer model. We'll make it optional. And for right now, for 1 second, let's set this equal to customer model, and let's give it an ID, of 1, a name. I'll just do Nick, points 5, premium, true. Let's just put this customer on the screen quickly. So down on our screen, let's create a VStack. Let's give it some spacing of 20. And I don't really care what this screen looks like. I just want to put the data on the screen. So we'll say if let customer equals vm.customer. Because remember, we made this customer optional, so there's a chance that there is none. So here we're just checking that there is a customer, and then we're going to put the text. We'll do customer.id. I'm just going to copy this, paste it 4 times. We'll do customer dot, what else do we have? Name, customer dot points, and this points is an integer, so we can just convert it to a string with the / open close parentheses. And then finally we have dot is premium, and I can convert this to a string with a dot description. If I click resume, we should at least see our data on the screen now. Alright, so again, I don't really care what this looks like. It doesn't look very good, but we do see that our data is pulling through, and that's all that matters. So to start, I'm going to actually set our customer, this optional customer variable, equal to nil. If I click resume, we can see that nothing's going to pull through because there is no customer yet. So once we update this customer, it should show up on our screen. Alright, so in our view model, we're going to create an init, and then we're going to create a function called funcGetData. Let's create another func called funcGetJSONData. Open close parentheses, open the brackets. And the reason we're going to add this getJSONData is to simulate getting data that we're actually getting from the internet. Because in a real app, this function would probably actually be download from the internet, and that function would return us some sort of data. But we're just going to create some mock data because we're not worried about downloading from the database just yet. We're going to do that in the next video. So this download data is actually going to return data. And when we download from the internet, there's always a chance that it fails. Maybe it doesn't actually get the data that we want. So we're going to make it optional. And what we're going to do right now real quick is not something that you're going to actually have to do in your app, but we're just going to create that fake JSON data. So to create JSON data, we can say let JSON data equals, and we'll use JSON serialization dot data, and we have this option here, data with JSON object and options. Now the options we're not going to add, so let's just open and close the square brackets to make that blank. And then we need some sort of object that we want to convert into JSON data. Before we do that, we're getting an error message that the call can throw but is not marked with try. So we're just going to use try with a question mark, because it's going to try to do this, but it's okay if it fails. And this question mark just means that this JSON will also be optional. So if I hold on JSON, click on this, we can see that the data is optional. And that's the same return type that we want here. So of course we can return JSON data afterwards. Alright, and the last thing we need is an actual JSON object that we will convert into JSON data. So to do that, we're going to create a dictionary. We're going to say let dictionary of type, and it will be a dictionary of string : any, and we'll set it equal to, so I'm going to use the exact same names that we put up in our model as well. So we'll do ID : and this also needs to be a string, so we'll just make it 1 2 3 4 5, comma, let's do name : let's make it Joe, comma, we're going to do points : colon, and remember points is an integer, so we'll just give this number 5, and then we'll do is premium colon, and this is a boolean, so we'll make it true. We're going to take this dictionary and we're just going to put it into this with JSON object. So again, we don't really need to do this in our actual apps, but we're just going to make some fake data, convert it into JSON data, and then return it into our app. So in our get data call, we're going to say let data equals get JSON data. And this is optional, as we see here. So let's just do a guard let statement. So we'll do else, and then we'll just return, and we'll just return. In an actual app and in the next video, we're going to want to maybe print something out or do something if we fail to get the data. But for our purposes right now, we know this is going to succeed because we're setting up the data ourselves. So now that we have this data, I first want to print JSON data colon, and then I'm going to print out the data. I just want to do that so that you guys can see what this is actually doing. It's converting this into JSON data. So now that we have this, let's open up the navigator. Let's take our view, which is the Codable Bootcamp view. I'm going to go into the app.swift file where our app main call is. Let's make this the first view in our app. Let's click a simulator. I'm going to use the iPhone 12, and let's run our app on the simulator. Alright, so when my app loads, it's just a blank screen because we don't have anything on the screen. We didn't actually load any data yet, but I get a printout in the console down here that we get the JSON data, and it is 55 bytes. So obviously this 55 bytes is not something that we can use in our app. But this is how the data actually comes when we download it from the internet. It comes in these bytes. So we need to decode this data into something that is actually usable. And just to iterate on what this is, I'm going to quickly convert this into a string. So we'll say let JSON string equals, and I'm just going to create a string from it quickly. We'll do with the data completion here. So you can create a string from a data. I'll pass in our data, and encoding will be .utf8. Alright, and then I'll just print out the JSON string just to show you guys what this actually is. So let's print. So let's run the simulator one more time. It's going to open up here, and we get this printout of the 55 bytes, and then we get a weird looking JSON string which has all of the data that we included, right? We have the ID, the name, the points, but it's in this very funky looking string. So obviously this again is not something that we can directly use into our app. It's got brackets, it's got slashes. This is good data, but it is not as comfortable and usable as a customer model, right? So what we're going to do now is convert this data into a customer model. Alright, so I'm going to close the simulator quickly because it does make the fan on my computer go crazy. And let's just jump back into the code here. I'm going to get rid of this print statement because now we understand what it is. We don't need to see that anymore. And before we use any kind of codable, I'm going to manually decode this data. So basically what we're going to do is the opposite of this get data. We had this dictionary, we used the JSON serialization to convert it into JSON data. And now that we have JSON data, we first want to convert out of JSON data and then get this dictionary. So what we're going to do is say let local data equals try, and we'll use a JSON serialization dot JSON object because we know it's a JSON object. We're going to use the one with the data completion. The data, of course, will be our data, and then we're not going to use options, so we'll just open and close the brackets here. Alright, from this local data, we want to try to cast it as a dictionary that has keys of strings and values of any. So let's say let dictionary equals local data as with the question mark, because we're going to try to convert it into a dictionary of string colon any. Alright, and if we hold the object button and click on local data, we can see that it is optional. And if we click on the dictionary, we can see that it is also optional. So I want to make sure we have both. So we are going to say if let this, comma, and this, then we'll open the brackets. So if we do get the data, if we do get the dictionary, then we go into this closure here. And we're basically going to try to extract the ID, the name, and the points from this dictionary. So I'll say let ID equals dictionary, and we're going to access the key by using a square brackets, and we'll put in the ID. And this key needs to be exactly the same as this key. We're going to try to cast it as a string. We'll say let name equals dictionary, name as string. Let points equals dictionary points as int, and let is premium equals dictionary is premium as bool. And once we have all of those, we can then create a let new customer equals customer model. And we can pass in our ID, our name, our points, and is premium. We're going to get a quick error. Because we are optionally casting these, there's a chance that this doesn't work and this ID is actually nil, and that causes a problem when we create these. So I want to point out here that if you're following courses that are telling you to explicitly unwrap these, it will get rid of the error messages, but that is not good coding because this is not safe. And if for some reason this doesn't work, this will crash your app, and we do not like this. So I never really recommend using this explicit unwrapping. We could give these default values. So we could say if this doesn't actually work, we will just do 2 question marks and we will default it to maybe a blank string or just a blank ID or whatever you want here as a default value. But even further, I'm just going to put all of these into the if let statement. So we're just going to make sure that we do get all of these before creating a customer. So I'm going to press enter on this, and I'm going to cut these, paste them inside the statement, just tab them over, and let's just add commas at the end of them. And then I'll put this bracket back up here. So we're going to say, so we're saying if we get all of this data, we can then create a new customer. And finally, we can set the customer equal to new customer. So remember, this customer is the published variable that should show up on our screen. All right, I'm going to run the simulator one more time. And as soon as it loads, we now do see our data on the screen. So just to reiterate what we did, because I know it might have been confusing, we created fake JSON data because when we actually download from the internet, it's going to come as data. So what we did was create a fake dictionary here. We converted it into JSON. And this data variable here, which is when we call it getJSONData, is how it's going to come from the internet. And now we need to take that data and convert it into something that is usable. So here we manually decoded it. We took that data, stripped out the JSON into some kind of local data. We casted it as a dictionary that we can then use. And then we looked into that dictionary for an ID, a name, points, and is premium. And if we got all that information, we created a new customer and then we put it onto the screen. All right, I hope you guys are still with me so far, but now we're going to get into the cool stuff. This was a lot of setup. So while this works, the problem here is that if there were a bunch of places in our application where we wanted to take data and convert it into customer models, we wouldn't want to have to write this code a bunch of times. And even writing it just this one time is kind of tedious. I know we only had 4 variables. Sometimes you'll have data models with a lot of variables, way more than 4. And in those cases, you don't want to have to be worrying about all of this, trying to cast it as strings and such. So in Swift, we can use something called Decodable protocol, and that's what we're going to get into right now. So let's first go back up to our customer model, and let's review what initializers are, because when we create a customer model down here, it created this initializer for us, and it basically has the ID, the name, the points, the is premium. So what that initializer really is a init. It has ID of type string. It has name of type string. And type this out if you're following me. Don't just listen, because we're going to use this in a second. Points of type int and is premium of type bool. And we will open the brackets. It then sets self.id equal to id, self.name equal to name, self.points equal to points, and self.isPremium equal to isPremium. So this is your default initializer that you're already using down here. It's just that Swift had made this for us. And here we are initializing with all of these parameters. But what we can do is actually make customer model conform to decodable. And this basically allows us to initialize a customer model from some sort of data, and it will decode from the data into a customer model. So to conform to decodable, we need a new initializer that has the from decoder in it. And you'll see here in this initializer, we can't pass in all of our data manually. Instead, we pass in a decoder. And to get the values from this decoder, we need to do a little bit of setup. We will say let container equals try, and let's get the decoder.container. And we see that it is keyed by, and there are a bunch of keys that we need to look for in this decoder. So this container is basically just the container inside the decoder that holds all of the data. And these keys that we're looking for is going to be all of these keys that we set up down here. So we manually added this ID, this name, this points, is premium. But when we're using this decode by container, we need to give it all of the keys that it should be looking for. So we haven't set up these keys yet, and we can do that very simply. So in this customer model, I'm going to create a enum. I'll call it coding keys. I'll make this conform to string, because down here these are all strings, right? We need the string version of it. And we will make it conform to coding key, which is what we need here. So we'll say coding key. Open the brackets. And then we just need to give it all of the keys that we're looking for. So we'll say case ID, case name, case points, case is premium. And this again, it needs to be exactly what our data is coming in as. So where we have our data, we have is premium, points lowercase, and when we were decoding it, we had the exact same strings, points is premium, and that needs to be the exact same here. And if for some reason you wanted to change the name of this variable versus how it was actually coming in, so for example, this is premium, maybe it was coming in with an underscore in it, so we could set the raw value, the string version, equal to is underscore premium, or however it's coming in from the data. We don't actually need to do this because our strings are perfect as is, but if you needed to customize it, this is how you would do it. So now that we have our coding keys, we can pass them in here. We can say coding keys.self. It's just referencing this enum that we just made. And then after we get this container, we then need to get all of these values. So we'll say self.id. Just like we did here, from this initializer, we have to set up all of these values. Self.id equals try container dot decode, and you'll see that all of these decodes have types. So this ID is actually a string, and I'm going to look for the one with a string.type. And we're going to pass in string.self here, because we want it to be a string, and then we just need to add in what key this ID should be for. And of course, we'll press the period and it will be the ID. We're going to do this for all the variables. We'll do self.name equals try container.decode. Looking for a string again, this will be string.self.name. Self.points equals try container.decode. Going to use the points, and this will be int.self. This will be for the points, and then finally self.isPremium equals try container dot, and this one is a bool. So I'm gonna look for the bool. It's up here, bool dot self, and we'll use dot is premium. So now we've completed our initializer that will decode for us. And because we have this decoder and it conforms to Decodable, when we scroll back down in our app, we actually don't need to manually decode this at all. So I'm going to highlight this and press the command / to comment this all out because we're not using it. And we're going to take our data and we're going to say self.customer equals, we'll add JSON decoder. So we're using the decoder now, open close parentheses. We're going to initialize a new one, and then we will do decode from. And now we need to give it a decodable type, something that conforms to Decodable protocol. And of course, our customer model already conforms to Decodable. So we can add in customer model.self. And we want to decode from data, which is our data. All right, and then we're going to get this error that the call is marked with try. So we could use this optional try here, but let's just be a little more explicit. So let's use an actual try. And we're going to have to use a do catch statement. So we'll say do, we'll put our code inside here. Then we'll catch, we'll say let error, open the brackets, and here we will print out error decoding, / open close parentheses, and we'll print out the error. I don't think we're going to actually have to catch any errors because we did everything correctly. But let's rerun our app quickly. I'm going to build it to the simulator. And when this app loads, we still see our data on the screen. So this time we didn't have to decode all of this manually. And instead, we just have this one line of code that takes the data and it decodes it directly into a customer model. So as you can see how this is much more efficient than how we started. And because we're not getting these errors, I could make this even a quicker one-liner by just putting it outside the do statement and making the try optional so it is failable. And I can then just comment this out as well. And we literally have one line to get from JSON data to a customer. And this is efficient coding. Again, I'll run it, make sure it still works. All right, and while we're here, now that we've learned the Decodable protocol, I also want to introduce you to the Encodable protocol. It's definitely used less because a lot of times, for example, we're downloading JSON from the internet. It's much rarer to have to actually post JSON data to the internet and send it to the internet. But that is possible, and sometimes we want to convert our customer model back into JSON data. So down here, we manually created a dictionary and then converted it to JSON. But wouldn't it be nice if we could just create a customer model like we did here and then convert that directly into JSON? Well, yeah, it would be nice, but we can't right now because the customer model only conforms to Decodable and not Encodable. And all we have to do is add the Encodable protocol. And to conform to Encodable, all we need to do is add a function down into our model. We'll type out encode, and we have this function for us that it's an encode 2, and basically it's the opposite of the decoder. So first here we'll create a variable. We'll call this container. And we'll set this equal to the encoder dot container keyed by coding keys dot self. So here the container had values and we had to strip out values. Here we're creating a blank container and then we need to add the values. So now we'll say try container dot encode, and again we have types. So first we're going to do the ID, which is string. We're going to pass in the actual value, which is the ID, and this is the actual current value of the ID that's in our customer model. So it's this variable up here, and the key for the ID, of course, will be .id. We're going to try container.encode string. We're going to do the name for name. Try container.encode. We want the integer, and this will be points for dot points, and then try container dot encode, looking for the bool, and it will be is premium for dot is premium. And again, this points, this is premium. We're referencing the current points and is premium in the model. So now we have our function to actually encode our model into data. So going back down where we have this dictionary, instead of this dictionary, let's just create a new customer here. We'll say let customer equals customer model. Let's initialize a new one, and you see when we have this initializer now, we have two options. We have our default, and we also have the ability to initialize with a decoder. But of course, we're doing this manually. Let's just do our regular initializer. Let's change up the ID here. Let's do just maybe 111. The name will be Emily. Points, let's do 100, and is premium false. So before we took this dictionary and converted it into JSON data, but we don't actually need to do that anymore. So I'm going to highlight it, comment it out, and now we can just convert this customer into JSON data. So we'll say let JSON data equals JSON encoder, open close parentheses, dot encode, and here we can pass in the customer. And just like we had down here with that optional try, we can do try question mark. And again, you can see how this is more efficient than this because we don't have to actually worry about creating these dictionaries anymore. We can just take our model as is in our app, and we can encode it with a single line of code, and it goes into JSON data. So if I run the app one more time, we should now see this customer. Here it is. And remember, our customer, we're encoding it into JSON data. And then here we are decoding it from JSON data. And I just love how simple this gets, because all this extra logic could get very, very clunky, very, very long to write. And using these protocols is super efficient because customer model, one line to encode, data, one line to decode. That's just awesome to me. And finally, after all of this talking, all of this setup, you're probably wondering why this video was called Codable, because we haven't even looked at the Codable protocol yet. Well, this is the magic of the Codable protocol, because I can go up to our model here, and Codable basically includes decodable plus encodable. So let's just write that real quick. Codable equals decodable plus encodable. And instead of conforming to both of these, we can just conform to Codable. And if I run the app again, now we're just conforming to Codable, it should still work. We should still see the data. But the really, really cool thing about Codable is that it does all of this logic here for us. So when we use decodable and encodable, we had to explicitly decode. We had to explicitly encode. And if you need to do that in your app, you still can. But the magic of the Codable protocol is that this is all done behind the scenes for us, and we don't even need to worry about it as developers. So I'm going to highlight the coding keys, the initial init, the decoder init, the encode init, and comment it out. So in our customer model, all we have is where we started with these 4 points, and then we conformed to Codable. So we didn't write any decoding logic at all. We didn't write any encoding logic. And if I run the simulator again, it still works. So all we have is this little bit of code. We have one line to decode. We have one line to encode. So all of this extra stuff we did just because I wanted to build you guys up to really prove what Codable is doing behind the scenes. Because I could have made a whole video where we just conformed to Codable, we ran the app and it worked, but you wouldn't really understand what was going on. So that's why I wanted to build up to this. And as you can see now, Codable is super, super powerful because it decodes, it encodes for us, and it saves us so much time and stress and worry trying to decode manually. Now there will still be times in your app when you might have to decode manually because maybe you have to customize the coding keys, for example. And if you do, of course, now you know how to add a decoder as well. Alright guys, we're going to start using the Codable protocol as we start to download data from the internet in the next couple videos. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you learned something. As always, I'm Nick, this is Swiftful Thinking, and I'll see you in the next video.